also as a writer?
It was something I wanted to write about for a long time, but it had to actually come out for that to be possible. Like I have all of these. I was trying to write Love and Money, Sex and Death for like 20 years, and it didn't work until I came out, So there was versions of selves that were buried in writing that never saw the light of day, or that I occasionally tried to get published and was always rejected, which is probably just as well. Editors sometimes make very good decisions when they refuse to let you make your mistakes in public,
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but then after it came out, then I wrote Reverse Cowgirl before I went on hormones because I figured it might mess with my ability to write, which it really did for years. So that's sort of like a bookmark or a bookend book that's the end of a previous life.
Right.
And it's 3 years where I couldn't really write. And then raving just happened very quickly. And that was sort of the new voice in a way.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that period where you were struggling to write and then that sort of ending in the rush of raving. Did it feel to you, you were worried in advance that you were going to have trouble writing?
Yeah,
Why?
I had elders I talked to people about, and most humans have gone through puberty and remembered it as a period of like emotional instability. And it's like, well, I was going to do that again, basically. But where it's not expected and there aren't, there's no affordances for an adult to be having puberty level emotional meltdowns, it's just not. And I just feel like writing is a bit of a finely tuned instrument and it was going to go out of tune in a sense. And it really did, yeah. Like for 3 years, I really couldn't get anything done. I mean, I did commissioned articles, but that's like, my second day job kind of stuff. But the real work wasn't happening. And then I have a bit of a tendency to mania, and I've learned to keep this in check by, in that state, not involving other people or signing contracts. But I kind of let myself go with raving. I was just asked if I could do that quickly. And I just said, yes, I can do a book in 6 weeks, And that being like pushed into that sort of, it finally kind of came, and I had something to write about and with and through. And that's when I came back. And then that enabled Love, Money, Sex and Death, in a way too.
Right, it's like an unstoppering or something.
Yeah.
In the period when you were having trouble writing, did it feel like there was something that you wanted to be sort of working with that writing was not able to touch at that point? Or was it that you felt like you didn't have access to writing in the way that you had before?
I'm always writing, but it was just bad, and there's just files and files of like failed projects and trying different voices and different approaches and stuff. And I'm one of those people who writes very, very fluidly, and it's all in the editing. And people think I write too much. You should see how much you don't see. So yeah, nothing was coming out of that. So I was just going dancing all the time. Sort of thought, fucking, I'll just I'm enjoying being in my body, and dancing helps in a lot of ways. So raving came about because I was asked if I contribute to the series Practices that Margaret Grebowitz was editing for Duke, and someone had dropped out. So Margaret was like, can you do something, on short notice? And I'm like, yeah, but it's got to be raving because that's all I do. And Margaret's like, oh, I'm not sure there's a book in that, or if it fits. And I sent her a sample, and she's like, oh, yeah, okay, great. It's on, Because like, there's nothing else I can write about. It's the only practice I had.
Yeah.
That's all I was doing.
Yeah, I mean, and you write about, like, the period that is in raving is sort of a homecoming back to raving after being away from it for years. And I'm wondering if you can just, like, tell me a little bit about what it felt like to come back into that space.
That's another threshold. The venue is now gone, so I'll name it. It was a place called Muse, which was a circus school. It's not far from where Nowadays is. I just sort of have this memory of like crossing the threshold. It's even in the book.
Yes, I marked it.
Yeah.
The way you write about it is really beautiful. It's
And
It's
I'm
about
with,
how the threshold closes behind you.
yeah. And I'm with, I think it's Q and Z. You know, everybody's just got initials in the book. And Q just sort of like brazens the door, you know, we're on the list, you know. And as a party where trans calls are supposed to be free. And that's sort of always a little bit iffy if that's going to be honoured. And the door person, who I've since come to know a little bit, who was very tough but fair, was like, all right, you know, and then we're through, and you sort of cross into a different space, you know, space that operates with different conventions.
And that was the first time you had gone back to a rave.
Yeah, the first one was a Muse. Yeah,
Right.
I can also name the party now that it's ended. It was Unter.
Oh, okay.
Like, I don't talk about the stuff that's ongoing in the
Right.
book to keep it a little on the DL, but that venue's gone and that party's officially over.
Yeah. What did it feel like? I mean, you write about it beautifully, but I want to talk with you about it too, about what it felt like to be embodied in that space, in a different body than was the one you had the last time that you were at a rave.
Yeah, it was first a little overwhelming, and it took me a while to get comfortable again. And I always loved dancing with other people. I was very sensitive about being bugged by other people around me. I now just so don't care. You know, I was getting knocked over this morning. I'm like, all right, you know, I'll bounce back. Yeah, it took and this common experience with ravers is it can take a good hour or even, you know, 3 to get into the zone of it. And it did take most of that morning to sort of like physically like grind the sharp edges of subjectivity off and just be a body and find one that I liked, like finally. It's like, oh, I like her. Yeah, this is good. This feels good, you know. So
Find a body that you liked?
yeah. It's like, oh, I like it now. Dancing always helped with that, but yeah, it just got so much better.
Yeah. Did you know at that point that it was going to need to be a new practice for you?
Yeah, I really, you know, like, I left that one and it was like, you know, 7:30 in the morning, and I got home. People like clocked me like coming off the subway. I wore a Rick Owens dress, which was like bad idea because it got all filthy, you know. And I'm like, oh, I got to do this again. This is just fucking great, you know. So yeah, unfortunately, my trans mom was also my rave mom, you know, and she's kind of hardcore and well connected, and it's like, all right, so this is where we're going next week, and you should be in this group chat, and you know, like, yeah. After a while, I just knew where to go, you know.
Yeah.
And I got clocked. Like, people knew who I was, which quite frankly helped. And I definitely played that card because I'm considerably older and I'm not waiting in line anymore, you know.
Yeah, I'm sure it would help to be recognized and sort of deferred to in those spaces.
A little bit. I'm you know, like, I'm sort of a guest in this world a little bit. You know, like I have a sort of liminal relation to it in some ways, but I'm not above being a little bit, you know. Yes, I'm here now.
Has that changed since Raven came out?
I get recognized a lot more, and sometimes people want to talk about it on the dance floor, which is I love people saying hello, but it's I'm busy here, or all like, you know.
You're busy trying to be, you know, just in one's body.
Yeah, like you'd sort of like catch me in the chill out, you know, like I'm gonna step off the floor after a while and go get water or whatever, you know. So yeah, like catch me in that moment, you know. And I'm out not just as a transsexual, but as a recreational drug user. So I might also be high. So it's not really the time for a theoretical discussion, you know, or if it is, it might just be silly. So I'm not complaining about this. It's sort of nice to have these little weird interactions and stuff. But
Right.
yeah, it is a bit strange. But I was line dancing last night, which is really completely different. Well, I got recognized at that, and I'm like, you got to be kidding me.
What was that interaction like?
It's just like someone's like, oh, I read your book, and I'm like, you know, well, thank you. What's your name? And I just sort of try to find out a little bit about the other person. You know, didn't have long because we were just literally heading for the door. Yeah, but I don't know, I always wanted to be a writer of the city, and I sort of became one, like Raving's my New York book, or really my Brooklyn book,
Yeah.
It's sort of very place-oriented.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. It makes so much sense to me that someone would come up to you at a rave or on a dance floor and want to talk about theory, because one of the things that's sort of exciting about your work, not just in this book, but kind of across your career, is this desire to collide theory and autofiction and the self, and like that you make the dance floor, you make the rave both you take us to the rave in the book, and you sort of auto theorize the rave as it's happening. So I think it's very funny and charming and natural, maybe, that then people encounter you live and think, well, I want to talk about the theory of what we're doing instead of just being at the rave.
Yeah, and like sometimes that's a good thing, but it's just sort of that fine line between, is this an interesting situation, or would we be better off doing something else in this particular moment? And that should happen somewhere else.
Yeah, sure.
But it's not everybody wants those sorts of experiences to have a space of reflection attached to them, but many people do. And I also co-curate a series called Writing on Raving, and we'll do an edited collection of that. So how do we add, like those little ripples of spaces to document, critique, theorize, check the tone in writing. So yeah, how do we sort of build the culture a little bit? Is sort of a project that with this, like I'm still doing the field work. I didn't stop, even though the book's been out, for months.
Sure.
But I also wanted it to be like a little gift to that world that was so helpful for me, and is connected to these other things of curating other writers and younger writers, and finding spaces to add on to the culture around it as well.
Yeah. It seems like the rave is such a fertile space for theory and for queer theory, because, at least as you write it, it is this space that is just full of portals, whether it is music as a portal, drugs as a portal, movement as a portal. I was so amazed by the term, which was new to me, which is the rave continuum, right? That like every rave can sort of achieve access to the rave continuum, which is like the rave that is outside time, that like every rave might touch. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that idea and the almost like the technical formal choices you made trying to kind of touch or bring us to the rave continuum in the writing in the book.
Yeah, and I wanted the book not to be a sort of description or representation of the world, but sort of extruding out of it a little bit, have a sort of different relation to it. And I wanted to sort of freshen the language up a little bit. And in a lot of the interviews, like, after the book came out, I kept getting asked the same stuff. And it's like, so the rave is utopia? No. The rave is transcendent? No.
You specifically say it's not utopia.
It's not.
Yeah.
It's not utopia. It's not transcendent. It's not resistance. Like, we tried all these languages and it didn't really help. So there's even a glossary in the back, which is a little bit comic. It's meant to be excessive and ridiculous. There's like 30 made-up terms for stuff, some which I sourced from the community too. Like a popular thing in the book is the names for types you encounter on the dance floor. Like there's the punishers,
right,
who think that they're having a good time has to be at your expense, and there's co-workers who just really tie one on so they have a good story for the water cooler on Monday. So I sourced this from people in that world, and I've tried to sort of acknowledge that in the book, But then some of the language is coming from actually kind of a critique of queer theory and theories of queer time, to sort of do that differently. How is transgender experience actually not assimilable in queer thinking? So yeah, the idea of rave continuum, that there's a stream of time that every good party is part of. There's also a sort of a writing conceit, because I've put scenes that happen at different parties together at the same one. A little bit of obfuscation and keeping things a little bit hidden. And also so I could just cut to the good stories, you know. You know, like you don't, although it would be kind of a nice conceptual writing thing to like write the boring part of the party.
Like the boredom of raving. And then but it's a totally different project.
Yeah. Like a Kenny Goldsmith kind of a book, you know.
Right.
I step to the right and I step to the left and I step to the right and I step to the left. The person on the left is annoying me and I step to the right and I step to the... Yeah, it was just going like that for 100 pages. Yeah.
I like it.
That could be a thing.
I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Rave Continuum is this other time you get into when sideways time opens up. And to me, that's a way of thinking about why it's interesting as an experience of temporality, this feeling of time sort of dilating out sideways, rather than there was a whole version of techno that's future-oriented. There's other theories of sort of queer time as, you know, like an edit in temporality. I was just trying like, let's do it differently. Like, and let's start with the experience of trans people on the dance floor and why we gather there. Yeah, so that's what's centered.
And so that was, I'm interested in this practice that you have of that kind of like feeling-led theory of like let me first try to capture the feeling of something and then find the language for it, or find a theory that can sort of begin to describe it. To what extent did that feel challenge? Was that a challenge in this, or did that feel like sort of the play and the joy? I also am just dying to hear what a rush this book came out in. This is a lot of writing for, what was it, 5 weeks?
About that, yeah. And there was time to revise it and so on. But yeah, and affect theory became a whole thing. But for me, it goes back to Raymond Williams. It's like classic cultural studies stuff, you know, like one of Williams' key concepts is structure of feeling. And putting those two words, structure and feeling, together already is a concept that has some tension. And also Williams thought about temporality in terms of structures of feeling, because they could be dominant, residual. What's the third one? The third one's sort of emergent. So there's a certain sort of temporality and hence sideways structure of feeling. Like, yeah, Ray Williams is one of like, I always forget to reference somebody in these books, and this one it's Uncle Ray. I kind of like, I don't think he's quite in the credits. But descended from that version of cultural studies is subcultural studies, which was like Dick Hebditch, who's definitely cited, and that book blew everybody's minds in the 80s was when I read it. So yeah, I was trying to, and Dick's like a more emotional writer than people credit him. He's now sort of a character people understand through Chris Krause's I Love Dick, but I knew him a little, and yeah, I think there's a sensitivity in his work that people miss. So yeah, this came a little bit out of subcultural studies.
How did it feel to be writing and writing fast? How was the experience of writing and writing fast after a couple years of feeling like you were writing, but it didn't feel like it was hitting?
And the way this was a subset of a common experience is the thing that takes the longest for me is to find the form of the book, and it's sort of distinctive for each one, although some have been a little similar, but there's always like, what are the constraints? What's the tone? What's the... how is it chunked out? What genre does it talk? Does it play with? And that usually that takes forever to figure that out. And then once I've got that, the writing's really quick. Like the writing's really quite easy. The rewriting will take forever, but once I've figured those formal things out, and once I figured out Love, Money, Sex, and Death was not just letters, but those ones, then the rest of it came really easily.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that. What did the epistolary allow that needed to be, that you needed for this book?
I wanted to write in the letter form for years, like decades. I've tried to write like that. And it's sort of like a minor form in literature compared to first person or third person.
Sure.
It's less second person. It's the dominant form of pop songs. And so we were hearing everything, like hip hop's an interesting example which went to first person and is sort of telling, heroic tales in the first person. But second person is this very common form of address. And originally it was 12 letters, and my editor, Leo Hollis, was just, look, the ones that get too abstract don't work. And so I sort of dropped 3 that were in process. And it's like, oh, okay, so it's essentially 9 letters and it's 3 groups of 3. And that's mothers, lovers, and others. And then it's going to have a cover letter at the beginning.
To the young self.
Yeah, that came later. The framing device came later, but it was like, all right, so that's the form of it. And then...
Why those 3? Mothers, lovers, and others?
It's sort of a book about... And the second person address, it's written back to actual or conceptual others that made me. And so it's... I got this from Audre Lorde, yeah? Like Zami's all about, mothers, basically. But in a very broad sense of the word. So yeah, I wanted to address right back to who had made me, in a sense. Although that takes a sort of abstract turn in the last third of the book.
Yeah. I loved, there's a moment in the second letter, which is to your mother, and forgive me, I'm gonna quote it back to you. When I started transition and went on hormones, the past all came back to me, came out of its nothingness, all the loss, all the pain, and with it an understanding of this compulsion to write, this refuge in writing. When I am writing, I am always writing to you, your mother, right? And I wanted to ask, was that a moment, this idea of like the past rushing back to you? Did that happen on a day, or was it sort of more of a slow rushing in writing?
Oh God, that still happens. It's and it's sort of I don't know how, but it did seem to be related to like you run your entire body and nervous system and brain on different hormones. Like, and particularly it starts to do it late when you got a lot of memories of stuff. Like, it really felt like it reorganized that. And I don't have a, endocrinological explanation for that. But, because my mother died when I was 6, and I thought I'd, like, dealt with that in some way. And, it, like, transition just ripped the scab off the whole thing, I was in therapy at the time, and I'd just be, like, bawling for the 49 minutes or whatever about it. And it's like, I thought I'd settled all this in my life, and it all came undone. And then relationship to past lovers, and like, it sort of was this whole settling my own past. So like writing to some of those figures sort of made sense, starting with my mother. And it's a bit of a conceit. Like, I found this postcard that she wrote me when I was very little that I forgot I had, which is also weird. And so it's like, I've been writing back. Like, I never got to write back when I was little. So I'm sort of feel like I'm doing that all the time. And it's a story I tell myself that makes sense of how I became a writer.
You said earlier, and it's in the book too, that this was a book you had been trying to write for a long time. You had the title of this book decades ago. What was the essence of this book that you had or were attempting even back then that couldn't find its form?
Not only did I have the idea for this book, I had a contract for it with Verso in like 92 or something. And I kind of mentioned this at some point. They're like, there's no historical memory. Like, no one will know that you took that advance and never delivered the book. It's like... and it's... the 4 titles are really important to me, and getting the title right is a whole thing. And I just thought the title was right, and it was important to be love and money, sex and death. So it's putting those specific 4 things together.
Yeah, tell me why. I just want to pause on that for a second. Tell me more about that.
There's a way in which love and money are relational, sex and death are states. So hence they have to be in that order too. Love and money is almost a dialectical difference of how the world can relate, and sex and death is these liminal states of otherness, one of which is final and the other of which is not. So they have different qualities.
Right.
The states, yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
there's less sex in this one than in Reverse Cowgirl, but there's enough, I think, to justify the title.
Yeah, sure. And the book, like, what wasn't there in the early 90s that then came into focus?
I mean, I wasn't there. I hadn't sort of fabricated the voice that could write it. And like some of these projects are very long range, and some work and some don't. I have so many failed book projects, like folders and folders of things that crashed and burned. But I just really wanted this one to work. But in retrospect, transition made it possible. Like, it wasn't. I had to settle a set of other things first before it could be a book. And also, I also had to not write it right away. Morgan M. Page, who is, trans godmother to us all, whether she wants to be or not, has 2 rules. One is never speak ill of other trans women in public, and the other is wait 5 years before you shoot your mouth off about all this. And I sort of cheated on that one a little bit, but I felt it's 5 years. I kind of, the really crazy emotional period where I was crying in coffee shops for hours and stuff is over. I kind of know who I am now.
And like this voice has come through.
Yeah. And it's the thing, speaking of other trans writers, that I learned from Tori Peters, it's like the moment of transition is just a moment in your life. You have to live it the rest of your fucking life. As a transsexual, like, how do you do that? So that's actually more... Cis people are interested in the transition bit as like spectators of it, but we have to live like this for as long as we've got. And helping each other do that is sort of like more difficult in a way than helping people through the actual, roughly 18 months of hormonal transition.
Yeah, you write something that I thought was just so beautifully articulated about how most trans memoirs are you're supposed to have sort of like asserted a final and complete self in order to have begun the story and then end the story. There's got to be a kind of a finality of embodiment and finality of internal self as like a barrier to entry for the form at all, and that's something that you have really wanted to actively resist, understandably so, because the idea of denying someone ongoingness in order to be able to tell their own story is such a paradox, such a contradiction in terms. And there's I was really taken, forgive me, I'm going to do it one more time, I'm going to quote you back to you. But there was a part on near the end, it's in the final essay in the memoir, that goes, the genre of a book of a body is a musical art, a time-based work of improvisation upon the given. You don't have to keep playing the same old tune. You can modify the form of man, memoir, essay, woman, academic, monograph. You don't have to break a form. Indeed, there's something coercive about that, the bad side of modernism. You can play with it instead. Play with the forms as given until they expand our possibilities and meet our needs. Thank you for writing that. I love that so much.
Oh, thank you.
It's just such an incredibly expansive and lovely idea, both about personhood and embodiment, but also about genre and thinking and writing and work. And I was wondering if you had a sort of a thing you were reaching for in that spirit with this memoir as you were writing it? The kind of playing with as opposed to breaking form.
Yeah, and I was always very attracted to very iconoclastic avant-garde modernism, but I don't do it. And I was like, why? It's like, oh yeah, you don't have to break the form, but there's a thing to learn from the breaking of it. Like a sort of more gentle relationship to it, less masculine one too. Like a lot of the big swinging decks of modernism always wanted to, like break shit.
Yeah.
And it's always like we're in the background putting the pieces together, like Leonora Carrington putting bits of surrealism back together so you can actually like feel it and think it and all that, So yeah, and I was sort of writing, and like if it works for someone to think that they have a true self that they have to discover, like bully for you, but I think that's nonsense. There's no such thing as a true self. Like we're always fictions that we create for ourselves and others. So that gives you a different way of thinking, like what's a better fiction? So this is not my true self. This is a better fiction that I just so much would rather play than, cosplaying masculinity like I did for years. And like sometimes pretty well, frankly, but it was just never, the suit never fit, like literally. So yeah, it's sort of like an art of both life and an art of art, is to sort of phrase it in terms of that improvised, play with the given. And it's not, you can be anything, like that's actually not really true. Like there's constraints, and art's better if you work with constraints anyway. And it's better if you try to work with the constraints of the kind of body you have, the kind of health you have, the kind of ability you have or disability. Like you work with that. And see that as things that can be affirmed rather than entirely in the negative. So I just sort of felt I was finally able to frame kind of the aesthetics and the politics and the everyday in the same book. Like I've sort of done bits of that in different places, and in the last few books they've actually sort of come together, sometimes in the same sentence. And I kind of like my recent books, but I'll start hating them pretty soon because I'll have to do something different. But yeah, that's where I got to at this point.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you what that practice of sort of nudging against or playing with form looks like for you. Like, what is that practice for you right now? Maybe let's start within your writing.
I'm having a year of no new projects, so these, like.
Wait, tell me about that.
Yeah, my whole life I was a U-hauler. Like I've spent only a few months of my entire life not in a relationship. And I've also always had a relationship with a project. So it's like, oh, I should, and I was forced to have a pause and be by myself in my personal life, like a couple of years ago. And I'm like, I should just intentionally do that with the work. Like I'm not going to sign a contract or, like formulate a thing. I'll just fuck around for a bit and find out, And that's hard for me, It's sort of, I'm just one of those people who needs to be working on something, or I don't feel like I exist.
Why? What provoked you to make that decision right now? That sounds hard.
Yeah, it was getting a little crazy doing 2 books in a year, Like it's just got to slow my roll. There's short books, and the Anglophone world's a little obsessed with the book as this big production you do once every 5 years sort of thing. And other literary cultures aren't always like that. There's a version of French letters where people do quick short things. Hervé Guibert, writer I admire, just basically did a book every year for years, and they're like progress reports. Well, Throbbing Gristle did like second annual report. It was one of their albums, and you could imagine a whole series,
I love that.
Yeah, but I felt, let's just pull back a little bit. I'm cheating a little bit. There's a couple of things, but there's no like book on the horizon.
So what does the space of no projects feel like?
fucking terrifying. Like I have to just exist as a human. I'm just not great at that, you know. Like,
I mean, because you've written in many places about how writing is like an essential, almost like survival act of dissociation when you need it.
Yeah.
And obviously, it sounds like you're still writing, but to be writing without the horizon point of a project must be
I'm
new.
just thinking this through as I say it, but raving sort of starts pretty much with the first thing I look for at the rave is like who needs it, you know, like there are people you meet at the party who are sort of passing through, and that's fine. But I'm sort of drawn to the personalities that like need it, like they need to do this to their body. And where managing that actually becomes the problem. But I'm sort of thinking maybe how I feel about writers too. You're like, who needs it? You know, in the writers that I know, I'm not going to name names, but it's like some of you bitches could be doing something else. You really could, you know, like. And if you're looking for, you know, like glamour or money or fame, you pick the wrong lane, you know.
Right. It sounds like you've always identified as somebody who needs it.
Yeah, and most writers, it's sort of like you have to do it.
Right.
It's a thing that is sustaining the possibility of the rest of your being, you know. Yeah.
And so, is this the first time in your life that you're kind of floating a little bit without a project?
You know, I filled the void with commissions.
Ah, okay, so you are cheating.
Well, I've been doing more commissions than I usually do, but I got rent to pay.
Sure.
You know, I have dependents living in Queens and then rent to pay on my apartment in Bushwick with my girlfriend, you know. So it's like, it's expensive. You can't live on a freaking professor's salary with dependents in this town.
Yeah.
So I've sort of adopted the personality of hack for hire a little bit. I have a spreadsheet of all the commissions that I'm working on. And it's great to have the constraints of, you know, it's this date, this many words on this topic, like bang, you know. It's like
there's something pleasingly not existential about that kind of writing.
Yeah, and I'm sort of a little resistant to the mythology around writing. This might contradict some things I said 10 minutes ago, but you know, it's work. It's a freaking job. Like you sit down and, you know, I had a background in journalism, and you know, you don't get to have an existential fucking crisis. Like the 1,000 words is due at 4 p.m. You know, that day. Like you get your assignment at 9 a.m. and it's coming out at 4. It's going to copy editor at 4. You know, so like you do it, and there's something very freeing about that training. So I think of it as, you know, musicians practice their instrument. You know, like you play the violin, you gotta keep working on it. Like you don't think about playing the violin, you pick it up. And I feel that way about the keyboard. You know, like I pick it up, like I work it, and I learn more about writing from jazz, I think, than from literature, and I just really admire those players. Like give them a tune and they've got an idea. You know, they'll find an idea in it somewhere, you know? You know, like Miles Davis, Kind of Blue, it's a bit of a cliche album to pick, but, you know, like that's all first and second takes, and they just got their head that morning. But that's how fucking good they were, you know? You're like, what? You got all those ideas out of that thing? You just heard it? You know, and I'm not claiming to have pulled that off, but that's the thing to aspire to, just that fluidity with improvising. Yeah.
What is this play that you're referencing in Love and Money, Sex and Death? This like playing and pushing with form. What is that? How is that sitting with you in the rest of your life right now?
I had to play with the form of my own life quite a bit when I transitioned. It affected all of my relationships, and my teaching persona had to be completely reimagined and rethought. Who I am when I walk down the street is different. So to not be too self-conscious of that in a bad way, to be anxious about it, but to think of it a little bit playfully. within the margin of safety, and it's like an older trans woman who's also white and kind of middle class. So I get a much wider window of safety than most of my sisters do, you know. But it's like, well, great. I'm not going to beat myself up about that. I'm going to use that to figure out how all of those are forms that one sort of takes for granted a little bit. And you do want to get the everyday to not be too much of a burden or be too self-conscious, but to just sort of nudge it a little bit and to think that way about both life and art, you know. It's like, oh, let's take a form. Let's take the epistle. It's got very, very long history and super interesting people have tried it for different reasons. Victor Shklovsky's book Zoo, for example, which is called Letters Not About Love. You know, Elsa Trillay said, yes, you can write to me, but don't write about your crush on me. And so he sort of circles around it, you know. What is it about that form, you know, and how can it... Why do so many trans people write in the second person? Like, that struck me as interesting. There's a bunch of them. So I want to... Then also the letters connect to those ones that are in dialogue with those. Yeah, so how do you take a form? Like, what's a theory book? What's a theory book independently of the way American complet, you know, elite grad schools made it into something else, you know, like they made it into something I didn't quite recognize. So how do we get it back to what Roland Barthes was doing or what Paul Virilio was doing? Let's get it back to that, you know. So yeah, it's like play with form. To sort of take it and you just like flip it around a little bit and you tease it a little bit. Yeah.
Is there a form that you have on your someday list, on your bucket list of things you'd like to try or to do or to subvert or play with?
I really love aphorism as a form. I just love to do a straight up book of those. Problem is I put all of them on Twitter over the years and I cannot get Twitter archive to download. So yeah, I really wanted to like cull it and just find the good ones and put them together. But yeah, I just love like the smallest form. How can you get a couple of sentences to both under and overstate something at the same time? Because that's what it does as form. And a good aphorism is completely unanswerable. Like anything you would say in dialogue with it is just ridiculous.
Which makes it perfect for Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's an aphorism machine.
Right.
And I'm drawn to people who were good at that. I'm also good to people who can do banter on Twitter. The algorithm has pushed us all away from each other, so it's not there anymore. But those were the two things it was really good for. People would always answer my aphorisms. It's like, yeah, but had you thought of this? Well, yeah, but, you know, it's an aphorism. Like, it doesn't have footnotes. It doesn't, there's never any argument with them, you know. They're both completely ridiculous and true at the same time. That's the point.
Do you have favorite writers of aphorism?
Nietzsche, Adorno, Sioran, although somewhat compromised figure, Chamfort, who's really underappreciated. La Rochefoucauld is a model of what not to do, because it's the maxim.
I see.
Yeah, but they do boil something down, and Chamfort does a little bit of that too. Canetti, also kind of a dick, but, you know, like the ones in the notebooks. Joubert, yeah, I just love this stuff. Lichtenberg is one of the go-to people.
Right.
The anti-Kant, you know, this like fragmentary thinker.
Right. Yeah, I feel like you need to get somebody to help you get that Twitter archive.
Yeah, you know, some of them have been good. Some of them have been really bad too. Obviously,
Well,
Twitter lets you just, you know, like it's so disposable.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I love that form. That's what I do. Science fiction porn, you know, I can kind of have at that.
Cool.
Yeah, you know.
Just gonna make sure. Just gonna make sure that I'm not forgetting to ask you anything that I had really, really wanted to.
Yeah, I wrote my porn book. That was satisfying. Which was Reverse Cowgirl.
Yeah.
Like every you know, like tenured academic thinks they have a novel in them, you know, and I'm like, nah, I'm not knowing it good enough for that. But I could write genre, you know, like genre is a little easier in a way. But it's got to be an easy genre, you know, like I can't make up plots, so it's not mystery. I can't world build, so it's not science fiction. Porn. Yeah, so I chose porn.
What about horror?
I don't really have that sensibility. Gretchen Felker Martin has this great book, Manhunt. I think I read Translit more than anything else. Alison Rumford. So there's stuff I read, but yeah, I couldn't do it.
Yeah, I ask because I did an interview with the poet Dorothy Lasky recently for Thresholds, and she's obsessed with horror as a genre and is doing a lot of playing around with horror and what it can be, and so it was just top of mind. We're just about at time. I was hoping maybe we could finish with you telling us what you're liking to listen to right now when you're in a sort of a thresholdy mood or in a sort of a portally space.
Oh God, the last Michelle Ndege Ocello album is pretty sweet. I really kind of like that one. There's two DJs who play together as Pure Imminence who do these ambient sets that are just divine, and I've heard those in lots of situations. I just really, really love that. Always jazz. Jazz is sort of like a. I was listening to Miles Davis' Sketches of Spain on Edibles, and it's like those arrangements are just insane. It's like, you know, it's almost techno, like the way he's sort of thinking about. Gil Evans is thinking about the layers of it and so on. Yeah, a lot of minimal techno, which is usually in mixes. So I'm not going to remember the individual track IDs. And I was trying to. Last few books I was trying to get out of thinking through jazz to think through techno. It's this more contemporary music that's about what can the machine do that it wasn't meant to. Like jazz is all about what are these instruments that are basically for a marching band? Like what can they do that they were never meant to do? Like what happens if you play them with love? You know, and techno is interesting because it's sort of digital instruments. It's like, oh, what were these not meant to do? So you're trying to think through, and it's much more about layering. It has a different relation to time and so on. Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about that. So playing a lot of minimal techno. Yeah, and which is, it's like an avant-garde that people actually like. You know, like John Cage's thing of like, if it's boring for 8 minutes, try it for 16 or whatever he said. Well, it's like, that's exactly what a rave is, you know? Like,
it's like, such a good point.
Just like grinding away on this minimal beat for like 7 minutes. And when the fuck is this thing going to change? And then like, what just happened, you know? And it's like, oh yeah, there's this extra little meep going on in it now, you know? So it's like avant-garde shit, but people actually like it, you know?
Yeah. I love that as the change, as boredom being the prelude to a change that you sort of miss as it's happening, and the way that you wind up registering it is as disorientation or confusion.
Yeah, it's interesting watching, like, after you've done it for a while, you take this for granted, but seeing people used to dancing to pop songs and stuff, kind of like, what do you do with this? And it's like, yeah, you just get like so unbelievably bored with it that you like lose all sense of time, place, and subjectivity. Like that's kind of the point.
Yeah, that's the goal.
But you gotta work it, you know.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think we should talk about, or anything I should ask you, or that you want to return to?
You know, I think that's plenty of stuff, you know.
We got a lot of good stuff.
Yeah. So the most recent one's called Love and Money, Sex and Death. It's published by Verso Books. The one before that is Raving, which is available from Duke. And before that was Reverse Cowgirl, which was from Semiotext. I just want to say 3 of the most delightful publishers ever, and like just absolutely on my bucket list of people to work with.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing collection of publishers.
Yeah. It's just like I always wanted to. I grew up on Semiotext books, so doing that one was so special. And my more serious side grew up on Verso Books, so that was also. And it's like being able to like intervene in some way in what Duke does at the moment, because they're sort of just on it with where a certain kind of humanities scholarship went in ways I mostly agree with, but have a slight different take on. And so getting to put that in the mix, yeah, I just feel so fucking lucky I got to do that.
Yeah, it's a
Can't believe it.
it's a pretty spectacular era of work, run of work, you know.
Yeah, I tried to sell out with Love and Money. I got an agent and all that, but it's I just love this little space I get to play in here, It was going to be a much more orthodox book if I, if I even could, sell it to a big 5 publisher. And it's like, I don't want to do that.
Yeah, more fun to play.
Yeah.
Mckenzie Wark, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jordan. It was fun.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks to Pioneer Works for having us.
Thank you, Pioneer Works.